Dear listeners, hello and welcome to a Geopolitical podcast episode Fault Lines. My name is Laura Maria Demchakova, and today we're going to be talking about Jammu and Kashmir and the infamous Kashmiri conflict, trying to comprehend the history, geography, politics of the historically longest pending dispute in the UN security agenda. Joining me today is Eloise Elizabeth Olden, a fellow student who is currently researching the issue. So Eloise, please tell us, what exactly is the Kashmiri conflict? Specifically, could you explain the historical background and narrative to this dispute for us to better understand what we'll be looking at?
Well, how much time do we have? The Kashmiri people have been struggling through almost constant regime change and political turmoil since 1586. To even begin to understand Kashmiri self-determination, it's crucial to trace the major events that have shaped Kashmir's modern political dilemma. Kashmir's history is a highly complex and volatile one, dating back thousands of years.
In that case, let's look at the current situation. We know that the region is vastly separated, but we do not understand the importance of this separation. Please tell us just how is the current region cut up and politically structured?
Well, as of now, the region is trilaterally disputed, and Kashmir is widely considered one of the most, if not the most, densely militarized zones in the world. India administers Jammu, the Kashmir Vale, and Ladakh. Pakistan controls the western areas and the northern regions of Gilgit-Baltistan, and China occupies the eastern border of region of Ladakh, also referred to as Aksai Chin. Within this already fragmented structure, the Shaksgam Valley remains especially sensitive because technically in 1963, Pakistan ceded that territory to China. However, India has never recognized this agreement and continues to contest the transfer. As a result, Kashmir is divided by geography, as well as overlapping claims of sovereignty, military presence, and unresolved historical disputes. This, of course, complicates governance of the region, with no cohesive representation present throughout the territory to this day.
So to understand how Kashmir got to this point of being so split up, let's understand and address when Kashmir was last autonomous. We know that in 2019, the revocation of the Article 370 happened. This article consisted of many symbols of autonomous Jammu and Kashmir, like the statement of a constitutional autonomy, which through the Article 35A, if I'm not mistaken, highlights that Jammu and Kashmir residents lived under a different law regarding property and ownership and citizenship from a provisional government. As well as it included both constitution and the flag of the autonomous region of Jammu and Kashmir. The revocation of this article by the government of India, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the BJP party, had eliminated all of these attributes and served as a so-called end of a Kashmiri autonomy. However, research suggests that this process began much earlier. Could you elaborate on the social contract that originally defined Kashmir's sovereign status?
Thank you, Lara. Absolutely. So, to understand contemporary Kashmir, firstly, we should look at the 1947 Instrument of Accession and the subsequent 1952 Delhi Agreement. This was a social contract wherein the state of Jammu and Kashmir was granted a unique autonomous status within the Indian Union, and under this status it was allowed to retain its own flag, its own constitution, and even distinct political titles. The head of state was, for example, the Riyasat, sorry for the pronunciation, and the head of government was the Wazir-e-Azam. Theoretically, this was intended to be a kinship of ideals, showing that a Muslim-majority region could thrive in a secular democratic India.
However, this contract seemed to fray almost immediately. Why did the democratic promise of 1947 transition so quickly into what Surinder Mohan calls autocratic decisions?
Well, the core problem leading to autocratic decisions was a conflict between the ideals of democratization and the anxieties of national integration. So by 1953, New Delhi, led by Nehru, began to fear that the mass-based leader, Sheikh Abdullah, might seek total independence, and this led to Abdullah's dismissal and subsequent arrest in 1953, a move that Mohan identifies as the beginning of the, quote, progressive dismantling of democratic ethics. From 1954 to the mid-1970s, New Delhi issued 28 constitutional orders that integrated Jammu and Kashmir with India, effectively dissolving the autonomy that was negotiated within the original contract. During this era, democracy was sacrificed basically for national interest, with the center installing pro-Delhi leaders like Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad and Sadiq through rigged processes.
There was, however, a brief and often overlooked moment in Kashmir's political history that scholars have described as a democratic breakthrough in 1977. Scholars like Stenman Malm points to this instance as a crucial turning point for the region. So what made that period so different? And more importantly, does this episode represent a genuine democratizing shift, or was it a temporary deviation within a long pattern of political control and constitutional limitation?
Well, the 1977 elections are widely regarded as the first free and fair polls in Jammu and Kashmir's history. For a period of about 7 years, there was a noticeable absence of violence and a somewhat functioning democratic framework. Even separatist leaders like Amanullah Khan of the JKLF admitted that during this time, the soil for armed struggle was not fertile, because people were busy with their daily lives and businesses within the democratic system. Although the intrinsic logic of the 1952 Delhi Agreement was sound in that it gave the Kashmiri community ample room and time to accept its position as a subset of India, unfortunately both New Delhi and Srinagar, quote, turned their backs on fundamental commitments to create a truly federal relationship. So to answer your question, this brief instant of successful democratization was short-lived, essentially due to what was a divide in the leadership. So, though it may be fair to say that the people were highly politically involved and hopeful for this wave of free elections with very high voter turnout, the corruption among the leadership or elites prevented any habituation of a meaningful democratic establishment.
So we now know that despite this event being quite small instance compared to the rest of the ongoing dispute in the territory, democracy was very much wanted. What then caused the collapse and drove the region to the small-scale civil war in the late 80s?
I think it was the failure of political institutions on the most part to handle pressure from an interventionist central government. After Sheikh Abdullah's death in 1982, his son Farooq inherited the leadership. In 1984, Governor Jagmohan dismissed Farooq's government in a move widely viewed as blatantly unconstitutional. This dismissal was driven by Indira Gandhi's desire to preserve her sphere of power against regional opponents.
This leads us to the infamous 1987 elections, correct? Many scholars and researchers have described these as an election cartel. Would you mind telling us what is the theoretical significance of this term?
In 1986, the National Conference and the Indian National Congress formed a tactical alliance to contest the 1987 elections together. Theoretically, this is an extreme and quite cynical form of consensus democracy, where the two strongest opponents merged to create a political monopoly. It left no room for legitimate opposition. So when the Muslim United Front came about, primarily to challenge this cartel, the alliance responded with blatant poll rigging. And an intelligence bureau source later estimated that the Muslim United Front lost at least 13 seats purely due to malpractice. So for many young Kashmiris, this was the point where they said, to hell with the democratic process, and picked up the gun.
Yeah. So I want to bring in the perspective of Kendala Balagopal here. Balagopal was a human rights activist and a lawyer who was known for his work on the issue of civil liberties and human rights. And to add to that, he was a civil liberties activist in Andhra Pradesh. He argued that the silence of Indian Democrats during this time, regarding Kashmir specifically, is a form of a studied and deliberate double standard. Can you explain to us how he views the conflict between the self-determination and the communalism?
Well, he asks whether the denial of the right to self-determination is not itself a human rights violation. He challenges the cynical realism of the Indian state, which claims it cannot allow a plebiscite because Kashmiris might make a communal choice based on religion. Balagopal points out the hypocrisy here. We don't stop elections in Maharashtra just because people might vote for communal parties like the BJP or Shiv Sena, yet we use that same fear to deny democracy in Kashmir. So he argues that freedom is a necessary precondition for self-criticism, and by shackling people, you prevent them from ever overcoming their own potential for communal divisiveness.
Now, turning back to the present, or specifically to the state affairs as of early 2026, the political landscape has shifted drastically since 2019 reorganization. How would you describe the current state of democracy in the region?
Under constitutionalism, it is basically a state of union territory rule with highly limited local power. So following the revocation of Article 370 in 2019, Jammu and Kashmir was split into two union territories, Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, the latter having no legislative assembly at all. The state has since redrawn the electoral map to privilege certain areas and enacted new, quote, domicile laws that allow non-Kashmiris to purchase land and gain state employment, which were rights previously only reserved for permanent residents.
Now, what about the current security situation in Kashmir? Recent analysis by the Council on Foreign Relations point to a notable escalation in tensions, particularly following a militant attacks and subsequent military responses in the region. At the same time, CFR assessments suggest that the broader conflict has entered a more volatile phase, with a more of moderate likelihood of renewed interstate conflict between India and Pakistan, driven by the persistent militant activity and fragile ceasefire conditions. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, it is correct that violence has risen recently. As of early 2026, the region is seeing its most significant bilateral confrontation since 2019. Civil society reports document widespread human rights violations, including over 8,000 enforced disappearances, 70,000 deaths, and the discovery of thousands of unmarked mass graves. Following a deadly attack in Pahalgam, in April 2025, India launched Operation Sindoor, striking targets in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Within the valley, there are massive crackdowns, and over 1,500 Kashmiris have been arrested. Journalists are being summoned to sign so-called peace pledges.
I suppose that we can agree that the current situation, despite many reforms over the years, is still very important and maybe not discussed as much. It feels like Jammu and Kashmir is in dire need of an international dialogue. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your insights. I believe that the public should find it very useful. Now, before we close this session, I believe that there is much to keep in mind for our listeners. It is crucial that we ask ourselves, how do we judge the degree of freedom of elections in Kashmir? Meaning, how is it that after an election, civil society is already demonstrating against the electoral results? And how do we interpret that turmoil? Moreover, from a theoretical perspective, how do we take into account historical grievances, especially when this element is so prevalent in Kashmir's case? And last but not least, When parsing the definitions of autocracy and democracy, do our models even fit this dispute? Is there a model or a theory in international relations which would be comprehensive enough to be applied to this conflict and its resolution? And should they even fit?
I'd love to hear what our listeners have to say on these questions.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.